a lot of the resistance training studies, it's not like they're trying to replicate each other's results. It's not like necessarily a replication crisis in terms of resistance training. I just think you have an issue of you're trying to study something. It's difficult to know, are these findings just chance findings or are they actual real, true findings?
Welcome to Corporate Warrior, the podcast that brings you the best advice on how to improve your health, optimize performance, and maximize productivity. With your host, Lawrence Neal.
Hi guys, I am Lawrence Neal and welcome to another episode of Corporate Warrior, a podcast that teaches you how to optimize your health, exercise, business, and lifestyle. My former guests include paleo pioneers like Mark Sisson and Rob Wolf, high-intensity training experts like Dr. Doug McGuff and Skylar Tanner, through to successful entrepreneurs like David Allen and Noah Kagan. Today's guest is James Krieger. James is the founder of Weightology, a website dedicated to delivering scientific, evidence-based information on body composition and nutrition. He has a master's in exercise science and a master's in nutrition. He's a former research director for a corporate weight management program that treated over 400 people per year with an average weight loss of 40 pounds in just 3 months. He's published research in numerous journals, including the Journal of Applied Physiology and American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Much of his collaborative work in recent years has focused on the impacts of training variables on muscle hypertrophy. And with that, we talk about one of his recent articles, which was an analysis of single versus multiple sets. And we also talk about the practical application of meta-analyses in general. A large part of this episode is focused on weight loss. James is an expert when it comes to helping people lose fat. And I think, it's really easy right now because you'll be absolutely bombarded, especially if you're listening to this early January. You're going to be bombarded by lots of different fad diets and things that just simply don't really work that well, or certainly don't work well over the long term. Some of the stuff James and I talk about today is what the science is saying when it comes to what tactics work and what tactics work to help you keep the weight off over the long term. So if you're looking for probably the most effective ways to lose body fat, you're in the right place. And we finish up with what has James changed his mind about with regard to nutrition in recent memory. As someone who's on the front lines with regard to the research, it's always really interesting to ask that question. What have these people been thinking about and actually changed their mind about in the last sort of 12 months or so? And we talk about much, much more than that. For all the show notes and links for this episode and all episodes, please go to corporatewarrior.org. Don't forget to hang around at the end of this episode for your free gift from me. And now I give you James Krieger. James, welcome to the show. Appreciate having you on Corporate Warrior.
Thank you for having me.
Cool. So before we get started, obviously before we started recording, talked about a couple of things I wanted to touch on with you. You recently put an article out on Facebook, which was very interesting to me, which is your very detailed review of the kind of latest research on volume and hypertrophy, and which draws upon a lot of the sort of meta-analysis that you've been doing with the likes of Brad and colleagues recently. And I think there was a picture posted along with that, which depicted that 3 sets were superior to 1. And obviously you've had responses from some researchers that question the practical application of meta-analytical results in strength training due to a potential replication crisis, which is caused by the different manipulations of other variables within the studies. I'd really love to hear your view on that response. I know that there was some correspondence that went back and forth, but kind of hard to find on the internet. So I was wondering if you could give me your thoughts on that response, but also perhaps start off with just framing what you found and what that review is all about, because it's in your members section. I can't access it.
Yeah. So what so for my research review subscribers, I wanted to write really the most complete review that I could that looks at all of the evidence regarding training volume. And in this particular case, when I say training volume, I'm talking about set volume, basically the number of hard sets you do per muscle group in a training session, and also on a weekly basis, and how that might impact hypertrophy. And the goal of that article, and it ended up being like a 6,000 word piece, was to look at the evidence from all different angles. So, when we talk in terms of muscle hypertrophy, first there's the mechanisms of hypertrophy, which is basically, you build muscle when you have, when basically protein synthesis, which is the process by which your muscles build new protein, when that exceeds protein breakdown, then your muscles get bigger. And so, so I started that article off basically looking at, both the impact of training volume on protein synthesis and also anabolic signaling. So there's signaling molecules that are inside muscle that basically signal your muscles to build new protein, and also on things like satellite cell activity. And satellite cells are basically muscles are multinucleated cells, meaning they have more than one nuclei. And so if a muscle wants to grow, it needs more nuclei, and so basically what satellite cells is they donate their nuclei to the new tissue is basically what happens. So I went over all of that evidence, and then I went over basically why the challenge with doing research on hypertrophy and set volume, and really I would say the challenge of looking at hypertrophy just in general, and really, this was also the reason why Brad and I and Dan Ogborn did our meta-analysis. And also, actually, I did one back in 2010, and then we basically just did an updated one, just last year. But this is the challenge when it comes to muscle when you're trying to look at training programs comparing muscle hypertrophy. Number one, changes in muscle size are very small. The typical increase in muscle thickness as measured by ultrasound that you might see over an, say, 8-week training program, 12-week training program might be around 5%. That's a pretty small increase. And the other problem is not only is the increase small, but the way different people respond to the same training program varies quite a bit from one person to the next. You can have some people experience a 10, 15% increase in muscle thickness, and you can have some people that experience no increase in muscle thickness. And so when you have that much variation and you're trying to look at small changes, when you're doing studies, it can be, and you have small sample sizes, it can be really hard to see differences between groups, even if there is a true difference. And I actually put a social media post about this not too long ago. I actually put out a little excerpt from the article, and I basically gave an illustration of just how difficult it is. I'm actually collaborating right now on a study that we're going to look at the impact of whether you need to be in a caloric surplus to enhance muscle growth and how big that surplus needs to be.
Oh, cool.
And something that you need to do when you do a research study is you need to determine, well, how many subjects am I going to need to detect the difference that I want to look for? And so I took data, and to do that, number one, you need to have an idea of how big of a magnitude of a change you're interested in. And then the other thing is you need to know, you have to have an idea of how much the stuff varies between people. And usually you get that, from other research. And so I actually took research from a study that I did with Brad Schoenfeld and Menno Henselmans. I think Brett Contreras was in on that study. I don't recall correctly, but it was we had done a study, this was like 2015, on rest intervals, the impact of rest intervals on changes in muscle size. And, we found longer rest intervals were better. But I took the data from that study and the variance data from that study to do a power analysis for this new study. And so I took the variance from that study, and I was curious, okay, if I just want to detect a doubling in muscle size, so let's say a 5% increase in muscle thickness versus a 10% increase. Okay, so that's twice the gains. Mm-hmm. If I wanted to detect that with what we would call 80% power, so let's say, in 80 out of 100 studies, I would detect a statistically significant difference, I would need 100 subjects per group to do that. And nobody has those type of numbers in weight training studies, in subject numbers. I mean, you just don't even come close. If I wanted to do like 50% power, it cuts it cuts my subject numbers still, but it's still like 50 per group. And you just don't have those type of numbers. And so then I did a power analysis. I was like, okay, what if I took the typical number you have in a resistance training study? It's usually like 10 people per group when you look at resistance training studies. The statistical power to detect a doubling in muscle size with only 10 people per group is something like 30%. So that means you would only see a statistically significant difference in 30 out of 100 studies. If you were randomly sampling 10 people at a time, you would only see a statistically significant difference 30% of the time.
How do they calculate that? How is that worked out?
It's what's called power analysis. You usually need special software, statistical software to do it. The standard is in research is, well, we want to detect something with 80% power, and so use that and your P 0.05 level and everything. It's and so when we talk about just traditional null hypothesis testing, which is what is done a lot in research, that's you have to basically run it through the software and figure out the calculations, and it's like you really need large subject numbers which you're never going to get. You're just not going to get that in resistance training research. So the next best alternative is to basically take as many studies as you can that have had small subject numbers and try to identify, well, what is the general trend among studies? Because one thing's for certain, let's say if there's no impact of training volume, let's say volume has no effect. Well, if volume had no effect, then if I, let's say, took 10 resistance training studies, what you would see in real life is that some of those resistance training studies would show an impact, a positive impact of volume. Some would show actually a positive impact of lower volume, and then some would show no difference. You'd see kind of a random distribution around that 0 point. And that's the idea of a meta-analysis, is you want to see, okay, well, how many studies favor the higher volume? How many studies favor the lower volume? And then you kind of look at, okay, what's the weight of the evidence there? And what we found when Brad and I did our meta-analysis is that almost all the studies favor higher volume to some degree or another. Some it's very, very small. Some it favors it very heavily, but almost none of them favor the lower volume condition. And you would not see that you would just not see that, especially, we analyzed 15 total studies. If there was no volume effect, you wouldn't see that across 15 studies. So when you take that evidence, you also take the evidence on protein synthesis. There's a study that came out of Stu Phillips' lab that showed 3 sets of leg extensions, created a dramatically higher protein synthesis response over 24 hours, actually 29 hours, compared to 1 set. In terms of fed a myofibril protein synthesis, which is what we really care about. And then if you look at, there's evidence on anabolic signaling, and almost all the data on anabolic signaling indicates more is better. And then there's a study on satellite cell activity that showed, at least in the legs, that more volume resulted in greater satellite cell activity. So when you take all this evidence and start to piece it together, you start to get a sense of consilience. And what I mean by consilience is when you have different forms of evidence all kind of starting to point to the same conclusion. I mean, the strongest form of consilience example that I can come up with is, we think of evolutionary theory. So evolutionary theory is supported by a huge amount of consilience when you compare genetics, the fossil record, paleontology, biology, all these different scientific disciplines all support basically the concept of common descent, as far as, how life has evolved on Earth. That's what we would consider consilience. So no piece of evidence on its own is really good enough. Mm-hmm. You can't just look at the fossil record and nothing else and say, okay, well, we know evolution happened just because of the fossil record. But when you have all these other pieces of evidence, you can start to say, okay, well, we know for a fact that it occurred. So when it comes to training volume and hypertrophy, now I'm not going to say that the level of consilience is anywhere near that of evolutionary theory. It's not even close. But I'm just more illustrating what consilience means is when you start to have evidence from different sources. So in this case, we've got evidence from protein synthesis data. We've got evidence from anabolic signaling data. We've got evidence from satellite cell activity data. Then we've got evidence from meta-analyses looking across a large body of studies that have small sample sizes. It starts to indicate, there is some effective volume on hypertrophy. How much of an effect there? We tried to quantify that, and we came up with some numbers, but those are rough estimates because they are based on a group of highly, heterogeneous studies, but there is an impact of volume, but it really comes down to the individual, like, how much is that extra volume worth it to them, to whether they want to do that. I mean, the numbers we came up with in our study was like, basically, if you were in the single digits in terms of your weekly training volume, in terms of sets, the average increase in muscle size was, in terms of muscle thickness, was around 5-6%. Mm-hmm. If you did double-digit weekly sets, that went up to around 9%. So you're talking a 5 to 6% increase in muscle thickness, up to around a 9% increase. So it comes down to what level is it worth it to you to do the extra volume? Someone who wants to maximize hypertrophy, if you're a bodybuilder or you just want to get as jacked as possible, the extra volume is going to be worth it. But the general population who just wants to add some muscle and doesn't care about getting as jacked as absolutely possible, the extra time that you need to do that probably isn't worth it. But that's up to each individual to decide. So I kind of rambled a bunch there, but that kind of
great.
Yeah, illustrates what my article was about, So
thank you. I appreciate that because I know that's in your members area, and you just kind of gave a good overview of that piece there for free for people. So I do appreciate that.
Well, I didn't go into all the details. I mean,
of course, yeah.
I just gave just a
teaser.
It's kind of a teaser. There's really a lot of detail in there that I've left out. I mean, I actually reanalyzed some of the meta-analysis data with in new ways and stuff. I won't go into that here, but there's a lot of did some exploratory analysis, and also I looked at studies. If could we get an idea of where the upper limit of volume is, and so there's a lot more in that article than what I've touched on here. That was just more kind of a teaser what's in there. So.
Oh yeah, I'm sure it'd be worth the investment to check that out. I'm curious, how has this? You obviously mentioned there, how it's kind of affected recommendations regarding programming. But could you just elaborate on, your most recent findings in this area? How has that affected your training recommendations to your clients? I'm not sure how much kind of one-on-one you do these days, or just recommendations in general to the kind of fitness community when it comes to programming.
It's just more, the only thing that it's done, I think for me at least, like I said, I don't have a lot of one-on-one clients, so just have a small number. But what it's done for me is it just gives me a better kind of range to start with. So if I have someone, so basically the idea is, if someone they want to get as jacked as possible, you might look at their previous training history and what they've been doing and stuff. And typically, I may shoot for that kind of double-digit weekly set range, probably in the teens or something. And then see how they respond. And if they don't respond very well, then, maybe you reduce training volume from there, or maybe you have to increase it. It depends on the person's history and stuff. I have been having some success recently with, some of my clients in terms I've been cycling their training volume. So I've been actually rampant, going from low to high, then back to low. And there's not a lot of good research on that. There are some theoretical reasons why that might be very effective. And, I've kind of been tossing around ideas in my head about why that might be effective. There's some research that may indirectly support that, but there's been no. It's hard to study that because to do a good training volume cycling study, you probably need a good 6 months or so of data, which is hard to do if especially if you're in a university setting. But yeah, so my clients have been having some success with that. It's like I'll ramp up their volume and then I cut their volume back down, and all of a sudden they have they set some new PRs, and then we slowly ramp their volume up again, and then cut it back down, and that seems to have been working well, at least on an anecdotal basis. I also know I know Mike Israetel and Renaissance periodization. That's kind of an approach that they use as well. And I know of some people that have used their techniques and have had pretty good success there as well. So that's an idea for, things that people can try. It's interesting from an anecdotal perspective. And I even think of that, I think in terms of HIIT and stuff like that. And, even back into the 90s and stuff like that, I remember people, get some people that have been, doing volume training for a long time and just had stagnated. And then all of a sudden they'd switch to a HIIT routine, and all of a sudden they'd get all these new gains. And then on the same token, there'd be people who had been doing a HIIT routine for a while and just had totally stagnated and weren't getting anywhere. And all of a sudden they up their volume and start getting gains. And so even from that type of perspective, it gives you an idea. Perhaps there is some value towards cycling volume over time. If you've been training high volume for a while, your body is likely adapted to the volume stimulus, and you perhaps maybe need to desensitize, and you've probably have accumulated a lot of fatigue. Perhaps you need to desensitize yourself to volume by going low volume for a while. And then when you go high volume again, you've basically, it's like you've been resensitized to that volume stimulus. And so there's some theoretical ideas why that might work, but obviously there's really no hard data on it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just jumping back a second, going back to the meta-analysis analyses that you were talking about just now. So the second part of my point was, you've had some research groups come back and question the practical application of the results in the particular context of strength training due to a potential replication crisis. What do you make of that? What was how do you think about that, and what was your response to that? I don't know if you. Well,
I want to say what I mean by replication crisis, because we know in psychology there's a big replicate. So when we talk in terms of replication, we're saying, our researchers, if they repeat a study, are they able to replicate the same results? I don't know if that's a case of a replication crisis in this instance, because a lot of the resistance training studies, it's not like they're trying to replicate each other's results. It's not like the psychology research where there's been someone gets some really interesting finding in psychology and other people keep trying to repeat it and it doesn't happen. So I don't know if it's necessarily a replication crisis in terms of resistance training. I just think you have an issue of you're trying to study something where the variance between people is so high in how they respond that it is difficult to determine. It's difficult to know, are these findings just chance findings or are they actual real, true findings? And I think that's more where the issue lies, and not necessarily I wouldn't necessarily call it a replication crisis. It's just I think you just have an issue with small sample sizes, and you don't. It makes it really hard to determine. You're trying to study small changes with small sample sizes, and that just doesn't work very well. But unfortunately, in the exercise science world, there's just not enough funding for people to do large scale studies. It just doesn't. You're not going to get. When we talk of organizations that fund research, they don't care about trying to get people jacked, so, they're trying to fund research to cure cancer and all that other stuff. So you're not going to get large scale funded studies, with large sample sizes, to be able to to be able to really get an idea of the impacts of training volume and things like that. And so you're kind of stuck with, you're stuck with, okay, we got all these studies with small sample sizes, and we're going to continue to have studies with small sample sizes. That's not going to change. I don't, unless some millionaire who cares about getting jacked suddenly wants to start funding this research, that's not going to change. And so you have to go with the best available evidence that you have, and where does the weight of that evidence point? And so that's the purpose of the meta-analysis, is just to give us, okay, what is the overall weight of the evidence? Is it perfect or ideal? I mean, like I said, the ideal study would be a large, huge randomized controlled trial, but we don't have that, and we're never going to have that. So you have to go with the next best thing, which is looking across the body of literature. And a meta-analysis helps you do that. And then you can also start to pull in, like I said, the protein synthesis data. Where does that point? Where does the anabolic signaling data point? And all of it points in the same direction. Especially, and that's another thing I want to point out, is you even have to consider like the measurement techniques that are used in some of these studies. So, there's different ways you can measure changes in muscle size. The best way are what we call direct measurements of muscle size. So that would be ultrasound or MRI. Those would be considered your gold standards for measuring changes in muscle size. Then you can do body comp techniques like DEXA or hydrostatic weighing or bioelectrical impedance and things like that. Those will be what we consider indirect metrics of body composition and changes in muscle size, or just, circumference measurements like with a tape measure or something like that. The problem with those measurements is that they have very high error rates. And so you are not, it's hard enough to detect small changes in muscle size with ultrasound. Now you're going to try to take this technique with really high error rates, and you do a volume study and you compare the body composition outcomes, and you say, let's say you tell me there's no difference, but you use techniques that the error rates are so high that you're not going to detect the small differences. And we even showed that in our meta-analysis when we analyzed, when we did a sub-analysis of indirect versus direct measurements of muscle size. The indirect, when you looked at studies that use indirect measurements, there was no impact to training volume. But if you looked at studies that use direct measurements, there was an impact to training volume, which means the sensitivity of the technique you're using to measure changes matters actually quite a bit.
Is this the same as test-retest error? Is this the same thing?
No, it's not the same thing as test-retest error. It's more just has to do with the sensitivity of the technique you're using to detect a change. So, like I said, a typical change in muscle thickness that you might see over a 8 to 10 week study is like maybe 5%, and that's via ultrasound. That's with that's directly using ultrasound to look at the change in muscle thickness. You aren't going to detect that type of change if I do like a DEXA scan. It's not going to happen because DEXA is not directly measuring actual muscle. It's what it's doing is it's making estimates based on the interpolation of the absorption of different X-rays, and it's not you're not actually measuring muscle when it comes to DEXA. You're just estimating it, and in fact you're not even not only that, but DEXA you're actually measuring fat-free mass, which is not the same thing as muscle tissue. Muscle is a component of fat-free mass, but I can actually show you an increase in fat-free mass on a DEXA scan by just having you eat before you lay on the table for your DEXA scan. So I've actually written a whole series on this on my website about body comp testing and the inaccuracies of it and stuff. So so it just comes down to the sensitivity of the technique. It's like, body comp techniques like DEXA or hydrostatic weighing, they just aren't very sensitive so you need large changes you need pretty large changes to be able to actually see a change, as far as statistically. With ultrasound or MRI, you can get away with smaller changes and see a difference. But like I said, even with those techniques, as I mentioned earlier here in the podcast, because people vary so much in how they respond, just the genetic variation you get from one person to the next is so high that you really need large subject numbers if you want to, detect even a doubling in muscles. If a high volume group had twice the gains of a low volume group, and you were doing your standard what's called null hypothesis testing, you would still need a huge number of subjects. So
yeah,
it's just the limitations we're dealing with when we're dealing with human people.
That's fascinating.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for describing that. I certainly think that's useful to know for the layman and people like me. So thank you. Another study I wanted to just ask you a little bit about. A study was a systematic review, meta-analysis, and meta-regression of the effect of protein supplementation on resistance training induced gains in muscle mass and strength in healthy adults. The conclusion of that, and I know you were one of the authors. I'm not sure, whether your work was referenced or whether you reviewed the paper or what. But the conclusion was that the recommendation was 1.6 grams per kilogram per day made a good contribution to muscle gain, but there wasn't necessarily the evidence to suggest that more would make any difference. I've heard some other views on this in that actually more may make a difference. Have you seen any evidence to the contrary, or have any view on whether or not a greater protein intake would produce more gains?
So I think when we look at that paper, and so yeah, I was involved in the planning process for that paper, and also
right,
as far as helping plan the statistical analysis and stuff like that, and then also I was involved in the write up and stuff on that paper. So the thing about that paper, and really any meta-analysis in general, and you can even apply this to the meta-analysis on volume, what you're considering there is just an average response or a mean response, really, across a population. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be true for every single individual. And really, this actually gets back to it. There was an article I co-wrote with Brett Contreras earlier this year on individual responses to training. And this is one of the limitations of research. When you look at research, they're always reporting on the mean responses, which is valuable. That's valuable information, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how you're going to respond on an individual level. And so you can even apply that with protein intake. Yeah, the 1.6 grams per kilo, that's a really good average number to start with. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be true for everyone. There could be a small subset of really hard training bodybuilders that perhaps maybe they need more, or just some people may genetically, for whatever reason, need more. And for example, there's a nitrogen balance study out there, and I don't recall the reference off the top of my head. Now, nitrogen balance is kind of a crude way to determine protein needs, but it still kind of illustrates what I'm talking about here. I don't remember the level of protein intake they gave the subjects, but basically I think it was probably in that 1.6 to 1.8 grams per kilo range. And most of the subjects were in a positive nitrogen balance at that intake. But there was one or two people who were actually in a negative nitrogen balance, meaning that they needed more protein intake than that. So that's kind of what I'm talking about, is that, yeah, on average, 1.6 to 1.8 is going to satisfy the needs for most people. But you could have occasionally a person who needs more from a muscle building perspective. Now, we also have to address, there's potentially other advantages to having a high protein intake that may have nothing to do with muscle gain. So, for example, if you, let's say, are on a fat loss diet, we know protein has a very powerful impact on satiety. So even if you're consuming more than that 1.6 to 1.8 gram per kilo, maybe it's not helping you from a muscle building standpoint, but it may be helping you from a satiety standpoint and a dietary adherence standpoint. So there's other factors you have to consider when it comes to overall protein intake, and not just the impact on the muscle tissue itself. So yeah, that's what I would say. for that 1.6 to 1.8. And it also would depend on, whether you're in a energy balance or an energy deficit. We know that being in an energy deficit impairs muscle protein synthesis, and that's typically why protein needs go up when you are dieting. And so again, for people who are dieting, there may be some advantage to consuming higher protein intakes than that range, because like I said, not only from a satiety standpoint, but there may actually be some benefits from a muscle retention standpoint as well. So that's why you might get some, like I said, most people on average are going to do fine around that intake, but you might get some people who definitely might have some benefit from doing more than that.
And now it's time for a quick break. Join me next year on the 9th and 10th of March 2018 at the Resistance Exercise Conference, the science and application of strength training for health and human performance. We are going to be joined by some amazing speakers, including Robert Morton, a researcher and PhD candidate at McMaster University. Rob is the lead author on two of the most important and relevant papers published in resistance training in the last 5 years. And his research primarily surrounds skeletal muscle adaptations in response to resistance exercise and protein supplementation. Though his focus is now mechanistic, he carries the unique ability to bridge the gap between the science and the practice. To get 10% off of your entry fee, head on over to resistanceexerciseconference.com and enter the coupon code CorporateWarrior10 in PayPal. So again, head on over to resistanceexerciseconference.com and get 10% off by using CorporateWarrior10 in PayPal, and I look forward to meeting you in person. Now back to the show. That's really cool. So you've got to take that as a benchmark, perhaps, and then kind of for your own results. For instance, if you are trying to optimize for muscle gain for yourself, you would need to kind of do an N=1 to see how your weight or muscle weight or lean weight changes over time, and then perhaps adjust based on that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And really, that's true for any. Yeah. Anything when it comes to that, you get back to the volume study. It's the same thing. We found an effect of, maybe 10 plus sets. You can start with 10, 12 weekly sets, but then you got to go, but on an individual level, some people that might be too much. Some people that may not be enough. And so again, these are just based on mean responses.
So you've got obviously a lot of experience working within sort of weight management, helping large groups of people and corporations succeed in weight loss. I'm really fascinated and be very interested to hear what has been the most successful in terms of overall programming for fat loss and weight management in your experience?
I would say as a protocol, I'd say just from not only my experience, working for the program that I used to work for was 2020 Lifestyles, and most of our clients were Microsoft employees. Not only working for them, but also just looking across the literature and stuff. I'd say a common denominator among, I think, really highly successful programs like that. I think number one is a high protein intake. There's consistent data that a high protein intake is very, very useful. It helps you feel fuller. You maintain your lean mass better. There's just a lot of positive impacts of a high protein intake from a weight loss perspective. That was something that we did in the program. The clients that we had, they were on pretty, relatively high protein intakes. And then I would say another component is, relying mainly on whole foods. And when I say that, I just mean limiting your energy dense foods, the high reward, highly palatable foods. Keeping those on the low end. I think that's a common denominator among, any successful weight loss diet for the most part.
Could you give a few examples of that? Because I think I know what you mean, but just to give some examples of the different.
Oh yeah. So when I say high reward, highly palatable food, I'm just talking about things like pizza, cake, ice cream. They're all very, the common denominator along those foods is, like people, they want to they try to point at sugar or carbs or, fat or whatever. That's not what the issue is. The issue is these foods, they just taste really, really good. They're very calorie dense, which means you pack a lot of calories into a very small package, basically. And so it's very easy just to passively overeat on them. I mean, I think in terms of pizza, I think most people can down a lot of slices in pizza in a very short period of time. And that has nothing to do with the carb. Pizza has way more fat than carbs, really. It's pretty high in fat, but there's nothing to do with the carbs or anything like that. It just has to do with pizza has a combination of fat and salt and and seasoning and palatability, and it's very energy dense. So it just makes you want to eat it, and it stimulates the reward centers in your brain to stimulate you to want to eat more. And so that's what I talk about when I talk about high reward foods. Really, the data is pretty strong that food reward and hyperpalatability are probably the main driving forces behind the obesity epidemic in the first place. And really, then when you start to consider popular weight loss diets, whether it's low carb or any other type of, or paleo or something like that, a common denominator, and actually I gave a presentation in Norway on this just recently. A common denominator among all these diets is they actually eliminate or reduce all these highly palatable, high reward foods, and which just causes a spontaneous reduction in energy intake. So I think food reward is a huge is really a huge thing, and if you can reduce the reward value of your diet, that can play a big role in helping you eat less. And I actually highly recommend Stefan Guyenet's book, The Hungry Brain. It's a great book. Stefan's a friend of mine. Actually, he's here in the Seattle area with me, but he does a really great job of outlining why high reward, highly palatable foods are really kind of a big driver behind, gaining body fat and everything like that. So I'd say that's another component. So you've got the high protein intake, you got reducing the food reward and energy density. And then I would say just a third section is the high activity levels. I would say is a common denominator among successful plans. If you look at the data from the National Weight Control Registry here in the United States, which is basically a national database of people who have lost, I think, at least 30 pounds and then kept it off, for at least a year. The data is pretty strong that the vast majority of the people in that registry are very highly physically active. And there's also good randomized controlled trial data to show that the more active you are, the more likely you are to keep your weight off, once you've lost it. And so I would say that's another component, is maintaining high activity levels. And that can be whether it's formal exercise or increasing what we would call NEAT or non-exercise activity thermogenesis. There's a lot of different ways you can go about it, but high activity levels seem to be a very big component of success. So basically I think you come down to three things: a high protein intake, reducing the energy density and food reward of the diet, and then also being highly active, I think are your three components to most successful plans.
That's really, really interesting. And obviously I've been in preparation for this, I've been reading a lot of your content, which is, talking about the research to show that. And it's fascinating because for a long time, and I still am relatively uninformed. I probably still need to do more research, but for a long time I became quite dogmatic about high fat, low carb. I was bombarded, as a lot of people are, with studies and books and what have you, from people in that area. And it is sometimes quite difficult to see past that and look at all the data objectively. And, so trying to stay open-minded.
And the thing about the high, low carb works. It works for a lot of people, but the reason it works is not really the carbs themselves. It's like, I think people, they get the reason wrong. The reason it works is it basically, when people go low carb, they have a spontaneous reduction in calorie intake. And the reason for that spontaneous reduction is twofold. Number one, part of it is typically when people go low carb, their protein intake goes up. And there's actually a study by, I think Soren is the name of the author. They actually directly examined that. They wanted to see, is the weight loss success that people have on a low carb diet, is it more due to the low carb or is it due to the high protein? And they found it was more really due to the high protein intake. Right. So that's one component. And the other thing is when you go low carb, you automatically cut out a lot of these high reward foods that I just talked about. You automatically cut out cookies and cake and ice cream and everything. And people cut those foods out because they have carbs and sugar and stuff. But what people don't realize is a lot of these foods actually have a lot of fat in them too. And basically you're eliminating a huge chunk of high reward foods from your diet. And so that's going to play a role in helping you eat less, basically. In fact, there's an interesting study and I think I even actually have a free article on my website about it, but, they took obese people and they were on a first they were on just kind of a standard diet. They switched them to a high protein, moderate carb diet, and there was a spontaneous reduction in calorie intake of something like 1,000 calories per day. It was a ridiculous amount. Oh, wow. Then they further dropped the carb intake from moderate to low. And there was a further decrease in calorie intake, but it wasn't that much. It was like maybe around 200. And so even right there, that kind of shows you that it's not really the carb intake. It was, the biggest chunk was just going high protein, and then, reducing the carb intake, like I said, may help with food reward a little bit. There's some evidence that ketosis may have an appetite suppressant effect, although it's not very strong data. But honestly, I don't know whether that's really that important, because really it's hard to stay in ketosis for long periods of time anyway. And it's not really, for most people, it's probably not a sustainable approach. So really it's just, like I said, you start looking across, all these different weight loss diets, and they all vary quite a bit. Some are very low carb, some are more moderate carb. When you try to look at, what's the common denominator? And a lot of it is they cause a spontaneous reduction in calorie intake because they eliminate, a lot of high reward foods. So, so that's really, it's a better explanatory factor of what's going on,
Yeah, I mean, it's just fascinating because I think for a long time, I advocated diets like high fat, low carb, and they do work, but not for the reasons I thought. So I would say to people, "Oh yeah, it's doing this and that," and I thought that was having those were the same mechanisms on myself, but actually, it was more likely to be the higher protein and a lower caloric load overall, and obviously the things you've already described. In relation to NEAT, which you talked about earlier, and it just increased general physical activity among those who seem to be more successful in keeping weight off. How do, knowing that data, how do people actually increase NEAT in a practical way for themselves to ensure, to keep the weight off, essentially?
I think that the most practical advice that I can give is an activity monitor. So that could either be just a simple pedometer, or it could be like an accelerometer, like a Fitbit or something like that. There's good research to show that those devices are very useful in helping people track their activity levels. Because one thing's for certain, we know that people, just like in terms of food intake, people actually eat more than they think they do. When it comes to activity, it's the opposite. People are usually less active than they think they are. And it's very surprising when you take people and you actually give them some type of activity monitor and they wear it, they actually get kind of shocked about how inactive they really are. And so I think that feedback can go a long ways in helping people improve their NEATs, because Because I think this happens a lot with people. People get really focused on just exercise, and they go do their exercise in the gym or whatever, and then they come home and they think, okay, well, I did my exercise for the day, I can just lounge around the rest of the day. Well, from an energy expenditure perspective, that actually, you may be doing yourself a disservice, or you may be canceling out the benefit of your exercise session if you're just going to be sedentary the rest of the day. Because really, even an intense exercise session, you don't expend a lot of energy. It's not, over rest. It's, you're not making a huge dent into your overall daily energy expenditure. And so you could really easily cancel it out by having low NEAT levels the rest of the day. So, and in fact, it's something when I've given a lot of talks on NEAT, and, a lot of it's been, my audiences have been like, personal trainers and things like that. One thing I will tell the trainers, I will say, if you are working your clients so hard that they're exhausted, and they're a fat loss, let's say it's a client that's interested in fat loss. I'm not talking performance or anything like that. That's a different ballgame. But if you have a client who's purely interested in fat loss and you're training them so hard that they're just wiped out, and they go home and they sit around on the couch the rest of the day because they're just too tired, you actually may be doing them a disservice from a fat loss perspective, because you want them to maintain as high of a daily energy expenditure as they can. And they should be just as, their NEAT levels are just as important as what they're doing when they're in the gym with you. So I think, like I said, pedometers and activity monitors are a really valuable tool. I have all my clients use them. When I used to work for 2020 Lifestyles, we had all the clients use them.
What would be the target like activity or steps or what have you?
It depends on where the person starts from. I mean, I like to see people in that 10,000 range or more, if we can. At the very minimum, I don't want to see their steps go down. So if they come to me and let's say their daily steps are 5,000, at the very minimum, I don't want to see those steps go down to 4,000 or 3,000. And I'm talking about steps outside of their exercise program. So one thing I do, at least with my clients, is I tell them, I don't want you to wear your activity monitor in your exercise sessions, because what I'm using this activity monitor for is for your non-exercise activity. I know you're doing your exercise. Okay. So I'm not worried about that. I want to know, what are you doing outside of your exercise session? And so if they're doing, let's say averaging 5,000 steps a day outside their exercise session, at a very minimum, I don't want to see it go down. I want them to at least see it maintain, but ideally I'd like to see it go up. And whatever's reasonable for that person. I mean, someone's at 5,000, they may have a hard time getting to 10,000, but I might be able to get them up to, let's say 6,500, 7,000. But I will say I do like to see people in that 10,000 range, and there actually is data to support that threshold. From an energy expenditure perspective, I've got one client now, she's doing like something like 20-some thousand steps a day. It's like an insane amount, but it was actually really helpful for her. We were actually kind of struggling. Things weren't really moving, like her measurements and her body weight wasn't really changing. And I said, okay, well, I want you to get an activity monitor. And so when she did that, she loved it so much that she started doing like 20-some thousand steps a day, and then boom, all of a sudden she started making progress. The weight started coming off and her measurements started to improve. So,
and it's all down to energy expenditure from your point of view.
From that point of view, I mean, really, it's about establishing an energy deficit, but yeah, I mean, the importance of NEAT is from an energy expenditure perspective. So, yeah.
So it's my understanding that resistance training, I appreciate that, day to day, it's not a large amount of calories burned, in a typical resistance training session. But it's my understanding that each pound of muscle will burn a slight increase in calories per day for roughly 72 hours post training. And then if you're doing a couple of training sessions a week, that can obviously add up. And then over a period of weeks and months, that's a number of that's quite an increase in energy expenditure. And then if you combine that with something like a fair amount of general activity that you've been talking about, that can be quite significant. Is that something that you agree with? Is that kind of how you look at things?
I partly agree with that. So I would say this: the increase. So there's different ways resistance training will increase your energy expenditure. So first, there's the energy expended in a resistance training session, which is not that high.
Mm-hmm.
Is typically, if you want to give a rough idea, it's typically a half calorie to 1 calorie per repetition that you do.
Wow.
So if you do 10 exercises of 10 reps each, and let's say they're all to failure, you've probably expended maybe 50 to 100 calories if you did 1 set per exercise. So it's not a big energy expenditure, but it's still, that's not to say that it doesn't mean anything. I mean, it all adds up. I mean, it's
right.
All the little things you do can add up, in a particular day. So there's that. Then there's the increase, obviously you stimulate muscle protein synthesis, and that is a process that requires energy and muscle protein turnover. The increase in energy expenditure you'll see over the next 24, 48 hours is around, there's a few studies that have shown pretty high levels, but those studies are kind of outliers. If you kind of look across most studies, you're looking at maybe around an extra 100 calories per day, maybe. So again, not a huge amount, but it can still be helpful. Then some people will say, well, what about the additional muscle tissue itself? Are you going to burn all these calories at rest? And that's not really true. If I add a pound of muscle to my frame, I'm only going to increase my energy expenditure by like 6 calories a day. So that doesn't really, because I've seen some people, this number used to go around like 50 calories per pound for every pound of muscle tissue added, and that's not true at all. There's no data to support that. I don't even know where that number came from, but so yeah, you'd have to add 10 pounds of muscle just to burn an extra 6 calories per day. So from that perspective, it's not very, you're not burning that many calories, but if you combine the training sessions itself, combined with the post-exercise energy expenditure, I mean, you're looking at, maybe an extra 100 up to 200 calories a day, when you combine those two numbers. So that's an okay amount. It's not nothing spectacular, but I think the benefits of resistance training go way beyond that. I mean, there's the maintenance of lean mass as you lose weight, which I think is very beneficial. And just from a health and strength perspective, and even an aesthetic perspective, when people lose fat, usually they want, a lot of people, they want to look better naked, and so it's that's what they want to do. But muscle is what gives your body shape. And so there's an aesthetic benefit as well. So I would say, the energy expenditure benefit isn't huge, but it's there. Now I will say there is some interesting data, but it's just, there's a few small studies, and so I don't want to draw any huge conclusions from these studies yet. But at least there's some data pointing this direction. I don't know what the mechanism would be, but there's a couple studies now that have shown weight training to improve NEAT levels, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Again, what the mechanism would be, I'm not sure. But there are a couple studies now that have shown that. So I think it's an interesting avenue that I would love to see some more research on, to see if that actually holds up.
That's really interesting, because I've heard that theory before about how strength training, at least anecdotally, seems to make people more active, from my discussions with others. So that's really interesting to learn more about that. James, do you have a hard stop? Because I was going to ask you like one or two more questions and then wrap up if you've got time.
No, I've got time. Yeah, we can keep going. Cool.
Okay. Just a few more things. So going back along this same vein, talking about NEAT, one of my listeners asked, how do you increase that with people who are already dieting and restricting energy, over a long period of time? Because perhaps it's more challenging for those people to increase their general activity if they're in that kind of position.
Yeah, that's a hard one, because we do know that when people lose weight, their NEAT levels kind of spontaneously go down. actually part of that decrease, there's data to show there's actually an increase in efficiency. So you actually will expend less energy for the same movement. And unfortunately, there's nothing you can do about that. That's a natural response of your body to being in an energy deficit. You can't stop that, but you can make a conscious choice to be more active during the day. And like I said, I mean, the best tool that I can think of is an activity monitor, because at least you get some hard numbers feedback, and also it's useful because when we think in terms of NEAT, walking contributes more to daily NEAT than anything else. Because it's hard to tell people, hey, you should just try to fidget more and stuff like that. And it's like it's for someone who's not a spontaneous fidgeter. I mean, it's kind of hard to constantly be thinking about that. But making a conscious effort to walk more is something everybody can do. And walking is a very powerful way to increase NEAT. I mean, in my presentation, there's a slide that I give that shows the energy expenditures of different activities. And even if you just walk at 1 mile per hour, which is, I mean, that's basically the starting speed on a treadmill, when you start a treadmill and it starts going. And I mean, you're basically like doing a tiptoe. I mean, that's how slow it is. You double your energy expenditure over sitting down, just doing that. And so just making an effort to walk more will go a long ways into it as far as increasing your overall daily NEAT levels. So I would say just trying to walk more is really the best tool people can have to try to combat the decrease in NEAT that can occur, especially if you're in a long-term energy deficit. And the other nice thing about walking is it's very, very low intensity. It's not exhausting. It's not gonna make you tired. It's a great way to increase energy expenditure without, hampering, interfering with your recovery ability or anything like that. So to me, I think that's the biggest tool people can use to try to keep their NEAT levels up as they lose weight.
Cool. So going back to nutrition for a second, what have you changed your mind about in the last year or in recent memory in relation to nutrition?
From a nutrition perspective, I can't say that I've really changed my mind on anything. I would say in the nutrition world, there really hasn't been any, I would say, groundbreaking research or any type of research that's totally changed the way we think about things. There's just, I really think the data now for a long period of time has kind of pointed in the same direction as far as food reward and palatability and energy density and protein and things like that. There's nothing that's come out that is, I would say, that's really radically changed any of that. I think a lot of the research that's coming out now either deals with mechanisms or just deals with some of the nitty gritty details, but I'd say the overall reaching thing, I can't think of anything that I've really significantly changed my mind on, at least within the past few years. I mean, if you start going way back, then yeah, there's probably things I've changed my mind. I mean, I remember, years ago, I used to be a big proponent of the idea that, hey, you had to control insulin levels to, control your body fat, but that was years ago. And I haven't thought that way now for probably 10 years. So, but as far as recently, there's been nothing that's really stood out to me that I would say, whoa, this really changes things. So yeah, I wish I could give you an answer there, but yeah, there just hasn't been anything. Yeah,
I always love asking that question because it's just always interesting, the different responses you get on that, depending on obviously what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, people like you are right on the the forefront, doing research, collecting data, and then analyzing that data, and then helping us less sciencey people understand it. So that's why I like to ask it. But would you be able to answer the same question in the context of exercise? I'm not sure if that's changed much, but have you changed your mind about anything there in the last year or in recent memory at all?
In recent memory, I would say yes. I mean, maybe in the past 2 years, I've changed my mind on this. And it's funny because I actually just listened to your podcast with Brad. I actually listened to it yesterday, but he kind of mentioned the same thing. But the thing that I changed my mind on was the use of high repetitions for building muscle. For the longest time, I thought your weights needed to be reasonably heavy, probably over 60% 1 rep max, and I felt like if you go, if you start doing 25, 30 rep sets to failure, you're not going to gain much muscle from that. And the research that's come out over the past few years, including a meta-analysis that I did with Brad, completely changed everything. I mean, we know now that you can do light weights, and as long as you're training to failure, you're going to get the same muscle gains pretty much as you would with heavier weights. And that was a radical shift for me, and it really actually, I think it was a very useful radical shift, because now it opens up, especially, let's say you have a nagging injury or something like that. It really transforms the way that you can train, and it can be very useful. It's a very useful piece of information that you can use, especially if you're dealing with people with joint problems or something like that. You're like, hey, you can use lighter weights for these people and still have them gain a significant amount of muscle. Now, obviously, high reps to failure are not any fun, especially with leg training. I still prefer the moderate rep range, just because high reps, I guess high reps to failure is fine with isolation movements, especially upper body isolation movements is not that big of a deal. But like when you start talking leg training with 20, 25 reps to failure, like I'll stick with my more moderate rep range. But yeah, I would say that's been the biggest change for me. And I know Brad would probably agree with it. I think Brad had mentioned in his podcast with you that was something that he obviously had changed his mind on as well, Yeah. So.
No, it's interesting. Awesome. This has been really good, James. I really appreciate you taking the time, and really fascinating to hear some of your views on exercise and nutrition. It's really helpful for me and when I'm working with clients as well. What is the best way for people to find out more about you and what you're up to?
Yeah, so you can go to my website, weightology.net. That's WEIGHTOLOGY.net. I have a blog there. I occasionally write some blog posts there. I have a big series of free articles. Earlier in this podcast, I mentioned, the articles on body composition, on body composition testing and how inaccurate they all are. I actually would recommend, probably a lot of your listeners might be really interested in that series, because people love to have their body fat tested, and I don't think they realize just how inaccurate body fat testing is. But I have a big, various free articles. I've got a big series on insulin that's always been really popular with people, and a lot of other articles. And then I have some premium content. I've got a research review that people can subscribe to. It's a very, very low fee of about $12 per month, and I review all the latest research, and that's how that set volume Bible that I wrote, that 6,000 word piece, that was for my research review subscribers. But so I've got that, and then I have some I do some online coaching as well, and then I've been on a number of podcasts. People want to hear my opinions on other things. Got all my past podcast appearances on there and everything. So yeah, so that's and all my social media links, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all that stuff is on there as well. So.
Awesome. Yeah, I really enjoyed your episode on Sigma Nutrition with Danny. He does such a good job, that guy.
Danny's awesome. Yeah, he does a great job. Yeah.
I aspire to be like him. No, that was really good. And I actually, I read a few of your recent articles. I read the one on dairy, and I read the one on sugar, being, people claim sugar's an addiction, and you kind of debunk that. And I really enjoyed that. And I do think it's a great way for people to, understand the science. I still think it's really important people do, click the hyperlinks and read the studies and understand the study design and the methods and so on. But to get a good kind of overall summary, I do think your articles are a great place to go. And for a lot of my listeners are advocates of high intensity training. And I know that you've done a fair amount of critique on that. And I think that's also really valuable for those guys to read. I know it can be difficult for people to kind of challenge their own kind of beliefs, but that's what we all should be doing, right? So,
definitely. Yeah. I mean, like I said, that's how I changed my mind on high repetition training. It's just like, the data told me that, hey, I need to change my mind on this, so. Yeah.
And don't worry, guys, I still do high intensity training. I haven't changed completely, in case you were getting worried. But for everyone listening, to find the blog post for this episode and all episodes, please go to corporatewarrior.org. And until next time, guys, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode. Before you head off, head on over to corpwarrior.com, that's CORP warrior.com, to get your free high-intensity training Google Progress chart and ebook with 6 interview transcripts of some of my top guests, including Dr. Doug McGuff, Drew Bay, and Bill Day Simone, on how to optimize muscle gain, fat loss, and overall health in an efficient, effective, and sustainable way. These transcripts are deliberately not verbatim. Instead, they've been transcribed in an easy read format to make it more enjoyable and easier for you to quickly pick out what you need and start getting results. To get your ebook, head on over to corpwarrior.com, enter your email address, then check your email for an email from me with a confirmation link. Once you click the link, you will be instantly redirected to a PDF version of the transcripts. This episode is brought to you by the Resistance Exercise Conference, the science and application of strength training for health and human performance. Would you like to learn from the top strength training researchers, network and connect with other exercise professionals from all over the world, join a welcome reception on a Friday night to build relationships with other strength training professionals, experience an early morning workout from an expert trainer to kickstart your Saturday, and get inspired, rejuvenated, and focused on your strength training business? I certainly do, and that is why I am attending and interviewing all of the speakers at the event. The Resistance Exercise Conference will be held on the 9th and 10th of March 2018 in Minneapolis, Minnesota at the Commons Hotel. To get 10% off your entry fee, head on over to resistanceexerciseconference.com, click the registration button, and enter Corporate Warrior 10 in the promo code field in PayPal. I'm very excited about this, and I've wanted to attend for years. Sign up now at resistanceexerciseconference.com and get 10% off with promo code Corporate Warrior 10, and I look forward to meeting you in person.